There are stories that begin with a scream. This one began with silence. In the archives of a small diocesan office in northern Italy, there exists a brief report dated October 14, 1978. The document is yellowed with age, stamped with an official parish seal, and signed by a priest whose handwriting becomes increasingly unsteady toward the final page. The report does not describe a murder. It does not describe a disappearance. It describes a painting, and a house where that painting changed every single morning. According to parish records, the events began quietly in a narrow hillside town called San Girolamo. It was the kind of place where church bells marked the hours and where most families had lived in the same stone houses for generations. The house in question belonged to the Bellini family. Marco Bellini was a carpenter. His workshop stood behind the house, filled with the scent of cedar and varnish. His wife, Elena, taught literature at the local secondary school. They had one child, a 10-year-old boy named Matteo. Neighbors described the Bellinis as calm, ordinary people. Nothing unusual had ever happened in their home, until the painting arrived. According to Elena Bellini's later statement, the painting was purchased during a late summer market held every year in the town square. The market attracted traveling vendors who sold old furniture, books, tools, and sometimes artwork of uncertain origin. Elena noticed the painting leaning against a wooden crate near the edge of the square. It was not large, perhaps 60 centimeters across. The frame was old oak, worn at the corners but still solid. The image itself showed a countryside chapel standing alone at the edge of a field. The sky above the chapel was pale and colorless, almost white. A narrow dirt road led toward the building, disappearing behind a small cluster of trees. There were no people in the scene. No animals. Just the chapel. Elena later said the painting gave her a strange sense of quiet. Not peace exactly, but stillness. The vendor selling it claimed he had purchased it from an estate sale months earlier. He knew nothing about its origin. The price was low. Elena bought it without much thought. She brought it home that afternoon and hung it in the hallway just outside the kitchen. The Bellinis ate dinner beneath it that night. No one noticed anything unusual. The next morning, Marco Bellini saw the first change. He was the earliest to wake, usually rising before sunrise to begin work in the carpentry shop. As he passed through the hallway toward the kitchen, he paused. Something about the painting looked wrong. He stood there for nearly a minute before he realized what it was. The sky. The sky in the painting was no longer pale white. It had turned gray. Not dramatically darker, but unmistakably different from the day before. Marco assumed he was misremembering. He called Elena from the bedroom and asked her if she remembered the sky being gray. She said she thought it had been white. They both leaned close to examine it. The paint looked old,
dry,
cracked slightly with age. It did not look recently altered. Marco laughed and suggested the morning light was affecting the colors.
They forgot about it.
The following morning, the painting changed again. This time the difference was easier to see. The gray sky had darkened further. Heavy clouds now gathered above the chapel. Marco and Elena both noticed immediately. Elena even walked to the window to compare the light in the hallway. The sunlight had not changed. Yet the painting clearly had. Marco removed the frame from the wall and examined the back. The canvas appeared intact. There were no signs of tampering. The vendor's paper tag still hung loosely from the corner. Elena suggested perhaps moisture in the house was affecting the pigments. Marco hung it back up. But that night, he woke briefly and found himself staring down the dark hallway. The painting sat just beyond the kitchen doorway. He could not explain why, but he had the strange feeling that the scene inside the frame was no longer empty.
He told no one about that thought.
Over the next 5 days, the painting continued to change. The clouds thickened. The sky darkened until it resembled the moments before a storm. And then something new appeared. On the 6th morning, Elena Bellini screamed. Marco ran from the bedroom and found her standing frozen in the hallway. She was pointing at the painting. At first he saw nothing different. Then he noticed a shape. A small dark figure stood on the road, leading toward the chapel. The figure was distant, almost hidden by the painted trees. But it was clearly human. Neither Marco nor Elena had seen it before. Matteo wandered out of his bedroom, and asked what was wrong. Marco quickly told him nothing had happened. But the boy stared at the painting for several seconds. Then he said something that Elena would later repeat many times during interviews. He said quietly, "Why is the man closer today?" The words unsettled Marco immediately. Because the boy was right. The figure did appear closer than it should have been. The distance between the road and the chapel had shortened. Marco removed the painting again and placed it face down on the dining table. That night, he decided the painting would be returned to the market vendor the next morning. But something stopped him. When he woke before sunrise and entered the hallway, the painting was no longer on the table. It had been rehung on the wall. Marco assumed Elena had done it. Elena insisted she had not touched it. Neither of them mentioned the subject again for several hours. But when Matteo came home from school that afternoon, he stood beneath the painting for a long time. Then he asked his mother a question that caused the first real fear in the house. He asked why the man in the painting was now looking toward their door. Elena felt a cold sensation in her chest. Because when she looked at the painting again, she saw the figure clearly. The man's head had turned, and the road in the painting now seemed to lead directly toward the viewer. Marco removed the painting once more and locked it inside the workshop. He told Elena the entire situation was ridiculous. Paintings could not change. People simply misremembered details. But that night, the first disturbance occurred. At 2:17 in the morning, Elena woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow,
soft,
and deliberate. She assumed Marco had gotten up for water. But when she turned toward his side of the bed, he was still asleep. The footsteps continued for several seconds, then stopped. Elena remained still, listening. A faint sound followed. It was difficult to describe later, but she compared it to cloth brushing against wood. The hallway grew quiet again. In the morning, Marco went to the workshop to retrieve the painting. The door was still locked. Nothing inside had been disturbed, except the painting. It was no longer leaning against the wall. It was hanging above Marco's workbench. Exactly level. Exactly centered. Marco stood there for nearly a minute. He knew he had not hung it there. Elena certainly had not entered the workshop. And Matteo did not have the key. Marco brought the painting back into the house. He intended to destroy it. But when he placed it on the table, Matteo walked into the room. The boy looked down at the image and went pale. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "The man is almost here." Marco and Elena looked down at the painting. The figure on the road was no longer distant. It stood halfway between the trees and the chapel. Its shape was clearer now.
Tall, thin.
Its arms hung too straight at its sides. But the most disturbing detail was the face. Because the face had no features. Only shadow. That was the moment Elena insisted they speak with someone from the church. Not because she believed the painting was supernatural, but because something in the house felt wrong. The air felt heavier. Matteo had begun waking during the night, and twice he had claimed someone was standing in the hallway. Marco reluctantly agreed. 3 days later, Father Lorenzo arrived. He was a quiet priest in his early 50s who served the parish nearby. He listened patiently as Marco and Elena described the painting. When they finished, he asked a single question. "Has anyone prayed in this house since the painting arrived?" Marco said no. Father Lorenzo nodded slowly. Then he asked to see the painting. Marco brought it from the hallway. The priest studied it in silence. Several minutes passed. Then he asked something unexpected. He asked if the painting had changed again that morning. Elena said yes. The figure had moved closer. Father Lorenzo leaned forward slightly. His voice lowered when he spoke. "Describe exactly where the man is standing now." Marco pointed. "Near the road bend, just before the chapel steps." The priest's expression tightened. He placed 2 fingers against the edge of the frame as if testing its weight. Then he said something that neither Marco nor Elena had expected to hear. According to the written statement later filed in the diocesan report, Father Lorenzo said quietly, "If the man in that painting reaches the door of the chapel." He paused. His eyes remained fixed on the dark shape inside the artwork. Then he finished the sentence in a tone that Elena later described as deeply unsettled. "We may already be too late." The priest's words settled over the room like a weight. Marco Bellini was the first to speak. What do you mean, too late? Father Lorenzo did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on the painting. The small figure on the road seemed almost insignificant compared to the chapel behind it. Yet the priest studied it with a seriousness that made Elena uneasy. Finally, he stepped back. In certain cases, he said carefully, objects can become vessels. Marco frowned. You mean haunted? Father Lorenzo shook his head. Not exactly. Something closer to a doorway. Elena felt a chill run through her arms. The priest asked them to describe every change the painting had undergone since the day it arrived in the house. They spoke for nearly 20 minutes. The sky changing color, the clouds gathering, the appearance of the distant figure, the gradual movement along the road, the footsteps in the hallway, the painting returning to the wall after being locked away. Father Lorenzo listened without interruption. When they finished, he asked if anyone had touched the canvas itself.
Marco said no.
The priest nodded slowly. Then he asked to move the painting. He carried it carefully into the living room and leaned it against a chair, so the image faced outward. The hallway felt strangely lighter without it. Matteo remained silent during all of this. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded, watching the adults with wide eyes. Father Lorenzo eventually crouched down beside the boy. Matteo, he said gently, when you look at the man in the painting, do you feel afraid? The boy hesitated. Then he shook his head.
No.
The answer seemed to surprise everyone. Why not? The priest asked. Matteo stared toward the living room where the painting rested. Because he's not looking at me. The room fell quiet. Elena's voice trembled slightly. Then who is he looking at? Matteo turned his head slowly toward the hallway. Someone behind the door. Marco felt a pressure building in his chest. He forced a laugh. That's enough, Matteo. But Father Lorenzo did not dismiss the boy's answer. Instead, he stood and walked slowly toward the front door of the house. He opened it. Outside, the afternoon air moved quietly through the trees. The priest stood there for several seconds, looking out toward the empty road that passed in front of the Bellini home. Then he closed the door again. When he turned back, his expression had changed. It was no longer calm. According to the written record he later filed with the diocese, Father Lorenzo noted a sudden feeling of unease at that moment. Not fear. Something deeper. The sense that something had already entered the house. He returned to the painting and examined the chapel in the image more closely. What do you see? Marco asked. Father Lorenzo spoke quietly. The building in this painting, it is not imaginary. Marco blinked. What? The priest pointed to the structure in the scene. The architecture. The bell tower. The small cross above the entrance. He traced the air with one finger. I believe I have seen this chapel before. Elena looked stunned. Where? The priest did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the canvas until his face was only a few centimeters from the surface. The Chapel of San Raphael, he said slowly. Marco had never heard the name. But Elena had. She felt her stomach drop. Father, that chapel burned down years ago. The priest nodded.
Yes.
Nearly 20 years ago. The fire had been small but strange. The chapel stood alone in a field outside the town limits. When villagers arrived after seeing smoke, they discovered the building half destroyed and abandoned, and no one had been inside. But according to local stories, the fire began in the small confessional booth near the altar. The chapel was never rebuilt. Its ruins still stood at the edge of the old road. Marco struggled to understand. You're saying the painting shows a real place? Yes. Marco rubbed his temples. But what does that have to do with the man walking toward it? Father Lorenzo's voice dropped. That is what concerns me. He asked if he could stay until morning. Marco agreed reluctantly. The priest wanted to observe whether the painting changed again overnight. He placed the canvas on the living room table where everyone could see it clearly. No one touched it again that evening. Dinner passed in uneasy silence. Even Matteo barely spoke. The sky outside darkened slowly. At 9 p.m., Father Lorenzo began a quiet prayer. Not an exorcism. Just a blessing for the house. He moved from room to room, murmuring Latin phrases under his breath. When he finished, the house felt calmer. For a while. Midnight came and went. Marco eventually fell asleep on the couch. Elena rested in the bedroom beside Matteo. Father Lorenzo remained awake. He sat in a wooden chair facing the painting. A small lamp illuminated the canvas. The chapel stood silent beneath its storm-dark sky, and the figure on the road remained frozen in place. For hours, nothing happened. At 2:11 a.m., the first sound broke the silence. A soft tapping. Father Lorenzo lifted his head. The sound came from the hallway. 3 taps. Then silence. The priest stood slowly. He stepped into the hallway and listened. Nothing. The house remained perfectly still. He returned to the living room. The painting had not changed. The figure on the road remained just before the chapel steps. Father Lorenzo sat again. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Then the second sound came. This time it was closer. A slow creaking noise, like wood bending under pressure. The priest's eyes moved toward the painting. He felt a cold sensation spread across his arms. The road inside the image looked different. Not dramatically,
but subtly.
The figure had moved. It now stood directly at the base of the chapel steps. Father Lorenzo stood up immediately. He leaned close to the painting. The brushstrokes looked old.
Dry.
Completely natural. Yet the position of the figure was undeniably new. The priest whispered a prayer. The air in the room grew heavy. Then another change occurred. Very slowly, the painted figure raised its head. The movement was almost impossible to see, but Father Lorenzo felt certain of it. The faceless shape was now staring directly at the chapel door. A moment later, the tapping sound returned. Not from the hallway this time. From the front door of the house. 3 slow knocks. Father Lorenzo froze. Marco stirred on the couch but did not wake. The priest approached the door carefully. Another knock echoed through the wood. He placed his hand on the handle. The air felt colder than before. For several seconds he hesitated. Then he opened the door. The road outside lay empty. No wind. No movement. Nothing. Father Lorenzo stepped outside and looked left and right along the dark street. No one was there. When he stepped back into the house, Marco was sitting upright on the couch. "You heard that too?" Marco asked. The priest nodded. They both turned toward the painting. Elena had entered the living room as well, holding Matteo close. Her voice shook. "What is happening?" Father Lorenzo approached the table again. His face had grown pale. The figure in the painting was no longer standing at the steps. It had climbed them. 1 foot rested on the final stone before the chapel door. The priest whispered something under his breath. Marco leaned closer to the image. For the first time, he noticed something else. The chapel door in the painting had begun to open. Only slightly. Just enough to reveal darkness inside. Matteo began trembling beside his mother. "Elena," Marco said quietly. "Take him to the bedroom." But the boy refused to move. He stared at the painting with wide, terrified eyes. "The door shouldn't open," he whispered. Father Lorenzo slowly reached for the frame. "What happens if it does?" Marco asked. The priest did not answer. Instead, he turned the painting around so the image faced the wall. The room fell silent. No one spoke for several minutes. Then Matteo said something that caused Father Lorenzo's hand to tighten around the frame. "The man isn't outside anymore." Elena frowned. "What do you mean?" Matteo's voice shook. He went inside the chapel. A faint scraping sound came from the back of the canvas. Very soft, like something moving against wood. Father Lorenzo closed his eyes. His lips moved in silent prayer. The scraping sound grew slightly louder, then stopped. The priest turned the painting back around. The image inside had changed again. The chapel door was now fully open. The road behind it lay empty, and inside the doorway, something dark now stood just beyond the threshold. Watching. Father Lorenzo stepped backward slowly, because for the first time since the painting arrived in the house, the figure was no longer inside the scene alone. There was now a second shadow behind it, and that shadow was beginning to step out of the chapel.